What wonderful music. Sure appreciate that piano. Well, good morning, and thanks for making the effort to get here. At this time, we're going to look at another side of the Genesis mandate and how mankind, after Noah's flood, the worldwide flood, was commanded to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And filling the earth is a geographical thing. The earth has a lot of land that humans can live on, and God did not want for the human population after the flood to hole up in Babel, and so God scattered rebellious mankind who did not want to obey his command to fill the earth, and through inventing languages so that people couldn't understand one another, they separated and they ended up spreading around the sea. And this is a bit of a side note, but one of the things that we think about at the Institute for Creation Research is how the worldwide flood gave just the right conditions for what would be an ice age. And Charlie Clough knows all about that, a whole lot more than I'll ever know. But during that time, if the water level, that is the oceans of the world, dropped a little bit because a lot of the water was locked up in glaciers, it would have allowed for land bridges that would have made spreading from Eurasia to North America and then to South America, as well as from Asia to Australia. It would have made that a lot easier. Not that it couldn't have been done with boats. Certainly boats can carry a lot in different places, as Noah's Ark had just proven. But land bridges would have been helpful in moving livestock and people as well. Anyway, we're going to be thinking about people in motion, migrants in motion. And God keeps a lot of us very active. And sometimes we are active because of the choices that we wanted to make. And then sometimes we are active in moving around because of choices we really didn't want to make, but circumstances forced us to make choices that we wouldn't otherwise have made. We see that in the book of Acts when the Great Commission, and when you think of Acts 1:8, you think of Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the outermost parts of the earth, and how God wanted his truth to be taken around the world to the different people groups of the world. And yet, it speeded things up. It was a catalyst for persecution to nudge Christians to move to places that otherwise they wouldn't have. And it's like seeds. When you think of taking one of those dandelions and going, whoosh, and those seeds scatter in the wind, well, that's what was happening with the different persecutions that are recorded in the book of Acts. And Saul was consenting unto his death, referring to Stephen's death. And at that time there was a great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem. And they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. They stayed in Jerusalem. Therefore, those who were, or they that were scattered abroad, went everywhere preaching the word. So you had a diaspora of Christian believers heading out in different directions, scattering in different directions, and taking God's truth with them. And so those who were scattered preached the word wherever they went. And we see that in the history that follows the first century, what would often be called church history, and really all history since the first century has been church history, including most of the first century. Luke 8 has the parable of the sower. A sower went out to sow his seed, and as he sowed, some fell on good soil, and when it grew, it produced 100-fold. 100-fold. God is successful in his activities, and it is his plan to scatter his truth and his people around the world, and he's doing that. But it's not the first time, that is, when we look at the New Testament, that's not the first time that God scattered his people and produced a witness in a different part of the world than Israel. We think of Jeremiah 29:11. Maybe some of you have some kind of a little metal plaque or something that has that verse. It's a nice verse to think about. I guess I'm curious, how many of you have something to remind you of Jeremiah 29:11, a verse card or something? Okay, it's kind of a favorite verse with a lot of people. But if you look at the context of that verse, the context is something not quite as warm and fuzzy as the promise itself. Okay, and we'll get to that in a second. But the verse itself is, "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end." So this is God giving assurance that he has good plans for his people. And his people needed assurance because the context of Jeremiah 29 is the people of Israel, God's people, were beginning a new life in a hostile, strange land. A land that they didn't, when they, if they'd have looked back in time 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years, and somebody would have said, "How would you like to leave Jerusalem or leave Judea and go live in Babylon, in present-day Iraq? How would you like to live in a heathen land?" Most of the Jews would have said, "No, thank you, I'm happy where I am." But God was going to send a whole generation and the next generation that follows to live in a hostile land. And yet he made this promise to them as he was sending them there through the agency of a very hostile military activity that resulted in them being taken captive and many of their relatives being killed. But those who survived Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, they made it to Babylon. And the picture of a ship there is intended to make you think about the wake of a ship. That is, when the ship goes through the water, it disturbs the water, it changes the water, and the water, as a result, has a different flow to it after the ship goes through. Our lives are like ships. And as we go through life, as God gives us different assignments and takes us different places, and we end up interacting with people along the way, for better or for worse, our lives impact other people who we come in contact with as we go sailing through life. And the impact that we leave on those whose lives we touched as we go from one day through to the next, that impact is, in a sense, part of our future. That is, when we appear before the judgment seat of Christ and we are given rewards for the deeds that were done in our body as Christians, whether we please Christ with the deeds that we did or whether we didn't please him and therefore those deeds are burned up like wood, hay, and stubble. But the impact that we have on other lives, if we were honoring Christ and we benefited somebody else and that benefit somehow made it into that person's life, that person may in turn take that benefit and pass it on to someone else. And so that person that you didn't meet directly, but you benefited indirectly because you passed on something of Christ's goodness to a person next to you who's like a domino. And they hit the person next to them like a domino, and you have this whole stream of dominoes that you were part of the chain. And you are going to end up with a reward in eternity for every one of those dominoes. God is very generous in giving awards. He is not stingy. I mean, this is everything about him. We see grace coming from God in all different directions. We see it in creation. We see it in salvation. We see it in him giving his word. And this is just God being gracious. He delights in giving us rewards when our lives are, with the help of the Holy Spirit, benefiting someone else, and then that benefit passes on, passes on, passes on. So you don't know the total good that your life is doing. You won't know it when you die because you've set some domino chains in motion. And those domino chains will continue long past when you are dead or I am dead. And so what follows behind us is, in a sense, our future. And that's what Jeremiah 29:11 is talking about when it says to give you an expected end. It's talking about what the consequences are to you, but they happen behind you. And here's the historical context of Jeremiah 29:11. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, unto all who are carried away captives, whom I have caused. Notice, God didn't say I let it happen. He takes credit for it. He says, I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem unto Babylon. Build ye houses, and dwell in them, and plant gardens, eat the fruit of them. Take ye wives, and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters, that ye may be increased there and not diminished. In other words, get used to living in Babylon. Don't act like you're only going to be there for a weekend, because you're going to be there for quite a while. It's going to be 70 years. So go ahead and plant gardens and get your family life established there. This is the place where I want you to be, in this heathen land. And seek the peace of the city where I have caused you to be carried away captives, and pray unto the Lord for it. For in the peace of it you shall have peace. So he told the Jews who were taken captive to Iraq, to Babylon, get used to living there, establish your families there, and pray for the welfare of Babylon. Because if Babylon has good times, you'll have good times. This will be for your own benefit, that you pray for the city that I put you in, for the land that I put you in. And of course, we need to pray for America. And we're going to be here for a while, unless the Lord takes us home quickly, or unless the rapture takes us out of it quickly. But we can't assume that that will be the case. So we would do well to take the directions that God gave to the Israelites at this time. And that is establish our family lives and pray for the city that we live in. And the peace of that place will provide a benefit for us as well. So when we think of Jeremiah 29:11, that God has good thoughts toward us, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give us an expected end. Think about the big picture. Think about how will the world be changed? How will people living in the world be changed because of my life here and now? Am I using this day to honor God and to do it in a way that blesses other people? Because some of those people will in turn pass it on to others. And they in turn, some of them will pass it on to others. And we want all these domino chains going in falling in directions that honor Christ. And that way our lives count for a lot. And God, who is very generous in giving rewards, will allow us to share in the blessings of others down the line, many of whom we didn't meet on this earth, but our lives influence that. I'll give a couple examples of that in a minute. It may take more than a minute to get to that. In the meantime, we'll return to the thought of persecution and how persecution sometimes moves you from one place to another. It could start with something as simple as a phone call. Hello? And your life may change from one phone call. Something could happen, and all of a sudden things are different after that. I remember as a boy learning one day, we're moving. And since we lived in the same home for 5 years, that was going to be a big deal, a big change. But God had His plan for our family and for each one of us, and we were greatly blessed because of that move. But sometimes you don't see it coming, and then all of a sudden, there it is. Sometimes you do see it coming, and you plan for your movement. We can think of people who have escaped terrible situations and have had to move across the ocean to migrate from one country where things are terrible to another country where they have a better situation, more protection. David knew what that was like. David said, "Now, therefore, let not my blood fall to the earth before the face of the Lord." For the king of Israel, he's talking about King Saul in the third person, For the king of Israel is come out to seek a flea, as when one does hunt a partridge in the mountains. Always like to have bird illustrations. I'm a bird lover. And here's David comparing himself to a partridge in the mountains. Partridges are ground fowl. That is, they spend most of their time on the ground. They're not flying up, like vultures and eagles and hawks. No, they can flutter a little bit and they can actually get off the ground, but they're pretty much going to spend most of their time on the ground. And they don't look like they're built for heavy-duty flying. But they're good at hiding among the bushes and the shrubs and things. And one of the ways that they avoid their predators when their predators come after them is they run. They scoot around and then they find a hiding place and hide. That's what David felt like. As a fugitive trying to escape Saul, he compared himself to a partridge, like those that live in high places. What are some takeaways, some practical lessons that we can learn from David? Well, one thing is, don't just surrender to your enemies. If they're coming after you, flee. When unbelievers persecute and aim harm at believers, and that's not a new thing, persecution of believers by unbelievers goes all the way back to Cain killing Abel. That's the first example of an unbeliever just for no good reason at all killing a believer. He just hated him because he was a believer. He knew that God gave favor to his twin brother, and that just made him angry. And he could have had the same favor if he'd brought a type of Christ type offering, but no, he decided to offer the fruit of his hands from the cursed earth and figured, God should just accept that because that's what I want to give. Well, God is the one who makes the rules, and God said, no, that's not how you worship. You worship using something that's a type of Christ, such as a slain lamb. Anyway, persecution of believers is nothing new. And we are told in the New Testament that when persecutions come at us, if possible, we're to avoid them. We're to escape them. We're to evade them. And so the verses in blue there are verses that talk about when one city mistreats you, shake the dust off your feet. Move on to another city that is receptive to the gospel and receptive to you as messengers of the gospel. Another lesson we learn is that God is sovereign. God took care of David during many dangerous situations where David was fleeing persecution, and it was unrighteous persecution. David hadn't done anything wrong, but Saul was jealous of him. So David did survive, and that's because God is sovereign and wanted him to survive. And if you think about it, the partridges that David compared himself to in 1 Samuel 26:20, they're still with us today. Over in Israel, those partridges are still there today. So if you're a bird watcher and you go to that part of the world, you hang out in the right places, take your binoculars, you're going to see some partridges. Well, the reason that they have survived generation after generation after generation to today is because God has sovereignly protected them as a population of birds. So as long as God has earthly work for us to do, He will sustain us. Okay, now I'm going to digress for a little bit before we go into a review of the Mayflower pilgrims, because they illustrate one of the main topics that we're looking at today. But before we start talking about the pilgrims, would want you to see a couple things. Yeah, obviously that's me reminding you again that I'm a bird watcher. That's in Florida. But and the umbrella, I'll be quick to say, has more than 6 colors. And that's important, because the 6-color rainbow is something that we don't want to identify with these days. But the real rainbow has 7 colors. And this umbrella here has more than 6 colors. But the man who's sitting at the table with me, he is an immigrant. He was born in Yugoslavia during World War II. And his twin sister did not survive World War II. But he and the rest of his family, a dozen survivors, made it to America. And he ended up coming as a boy less than 10 years old, something like 6 or something. He ended up going to Moody Bible Institute and became a youth pastor and taught the Bible. But his family went through many adventures, and at some points they got separated. At one point, his mother was captured by Nazis. She was able to escape, ran underneath a parked train to get away from the guard who was chasing her. The father was drafted by the Yugoslavian army, and then eventually was able to get away from that when Yugoslavia kind of split. Then the Nazis tried to draft him as a soldier. The communist Yugoslavians tried to draft him as a soldier. The fact that their family just stayed together is just one providential miracle after another. There's three kinds of family history, and my main topic in this hour is family history. When we think of family history, what we typically think of is the family that God chose you to be born in. And that's your most immediate family history. And so there's some exciting things that I learned about my family history when members of my family who'd kept really good records passed them on, and I was able to get a very large set of some of them. And it helps me to realize that God was at work generations before I came along, just so that I could come along. And at one point, there was one line of my family that was in Connecticut, and the Puritan family that I traced back to that lived there, all of the men went out to go hunting one day, and they left the women and children behind in the fenced compound where all the little houses were. Well, as it turned out, that day a very young boy who I'm descended from begged and begged and begged to go with the men to go hunting. He was probably about kindergarten age at that point. And so he likely, instead of contributing in a big way toward the success of the hunting, was maybe more on the other side, that somebody had to mind him and make sure he didn't cause trouble or make loud noises and spook the deer and whatever. But he was allowed to go that day. Well, that day, the Indians attacked the village when the men were gone, burned it down, and killed everyone who was there. All of the women, all of the children, and if there were any elderly who were there who didn't go on the hunting thing. So the only people who survived of that community that day were those who'd gone hunting. Well, that meant that little boy survived because he went hunting. If he had been where all the other children were, he would not have survived, which means he would not have later grown to adulthood, gotten married, become a father, and left an issue of descendants, of which I am one. So I'm very appreciative that God made sure that he went hunting that day. And if you check your own family history, you will find there are near-miss providences like that again and again and again, which exhibit God's care in making sure that you got procreated in the first place. So that's part of your family history, and I encourage you to take the time and do some effort. And if you're not the one in your family who seems to have the records or access to the records, find out who is and do a little extra effort. And in the end, you will be more appreciative to God for the work he did to take care of different things that needed to happen along the way in history before you got here, just so that you could get here. The second form of family history I encourage you to check into is for those of you who are married, learn the family history of your spouse. One of the things that I had the opportunity to learn about Sherry was that one of her lines goes back to Switzerland and the area near Zurich where that part of the Reformation happened. And in the year 1743, a ship called the Francis and Elizabeth left taking people who'd come down the Rhine and gotten on the boat in Netherlands. And they went across the Atlantic and they landed in Philadelphia. And they settled there. The first generation settled there in Pennsylvania. eventually some of those descendants made it down to North Carolina, and some of them from North Carolina to Texas. And there's a whole lot of adventures along the way. And marrying into that line was some Abernethys. And Abernethys were from Scotland. Scotland has had many wars with England. Many wars with England. And in one of those wars, the English, won the battle, and they took a lot of prisoners, and they told the prisoners, you're really guilty of treason. You're supposed to be obeying the leadership that presently rules the island of Britain, and you have rebelled against that, so you're guilty of treason, and we're going to give you the death penalty. We're going to hang you, but we don't have enough ropes or enough guys to do it all in one day, so you're going to have to take turns. So we're going to hang so many on one day, and then so many on the next day, and so many, and so you're for Tuesday, and you're for Wednesday, and you're for Thursday. And this one fellow named Robert Abernethy, he was told which day would be his. And I would think that he would be praying about that. But whether he was or he wasn't, before that day arrived, another commanding officer from the British came over and said, you know what, let's not hang all these guys. Let's send some of them to America. If they promise they'll never come back and cause trouble. So they approached Robert Abernethy and said, we're thinking of sending you to America, to a place called Virginia. And if we were to do that instead of hanging you, would you promise on your honor never to come back to the British Isles and cause trouble? You know what? He promised. And so they put him on a boat, and he became an indentured servant to pay for his travels across the boat. And when he arrived, as part of his indentured servitude, his first task was to make a casket. Might have reminded him of what he just missed out on. And he was to make a wooden box for a man who had gotten killed by a tree. They were cutting down a tree, and it fell the wrong way and crushed the guy and killed him. And so he was to make a wooden box for that man who had died. And in the process of making the wooden box, because it took a little while to do that, he got to know the man's widow. And he ended up marrying her. And they had a son, and they named him Robert. And that Robert grew up and got married and had a son, and named him Robert. And that son grew up, got married, had a son, and they named him, you guessed it. And then the next generation, there was a George. Of course, I think there was also a Robert, but there was several children. But anyway, after 4 Roberts, you get to my wife's line. But the point is, if they had killed the first Robert Abernethy on the island of Britain, there never would have been a Sherry Johnson. I wouldn't be married. I wouldn't be a father. I wouldn't be a grandfather. So the second kind of family history I encourage you to study in order to appreciate what God has done just to give you your spouse is to study the family history that demonstrates God's acts of kindness and providence to give you the person that you are now married to. And in many cases is the one who you have had children with and maybe grandchildren if you're old enough. Okay, then the third category is the forever family, and that is, what about the people that God has included in your life who have helped you spiritually? So it may not be a blood relation, it may not be related. This person may not be related to you by marriage, but this person may have been a really important person that God used to teach you the Bible, to disciple you in the Christian faith, to help you through a hard time spiritually when it was a really hard time. In my case, the one who taught me the Bible is the man that you see underneath the umbrella looking out toward the lake where we watch birds. And that's my youth pastor. So he was my youth pastor back in the early 70s. And I decided to study his family history so that I could better appreciate all of the work that God did to get him to America and to get him to be my youth pastor so that he could take his Moody Bible Institute training and teach me a lot of the Bible at a time when I needed it because I didn't grow up in a Bible-believing home. And so it turned out that his family history was so amazing and so filled with adventures and near misses with death that it took 4 history journal articles. That is a mini-series. I wrote a mini-series of articles and got them published in a history journal of how his family made it through World War II and ended up in America. But I claim that as part of my family history because of me belonging to the Forever family and God choosing to use that man, Bob Webble, to teach me the Bible and to be a blessing in many, many ways. So I encourage you to find out about your own blood family history and then your own related by marriage family history, and then if there are particular persons in your life who God put in your life who blessed you, even though they're not blood relations or they're not related by marriage, study their family history and you will be learning how God acted in the past just so that you could be blessed in the way that you have been blessed in this life. Now, in a sense, this is really just one piece of church history. But usually when you hear the phrase church history, you just think of the great reformers and those who led revivals and those who led foreign missions and things like this. But we're all commanded to be part of the Great Commission. And we all have the duties that go with the Genesis mandate. So really, however God has been acting in history in your family, in your spouse's family, or in the family histories of those who he's chosen to use to bless you, that really is part of the history that you can appreciate God better for if you take the time to learn it. All right, so now we're going to use the pilgrims as an example of God moving people and doing Great Commission and Genesis mandate things at the same time, because they really do blend both at the same time. And obviously Thanksgiving is a lot more than just eating a turkey, although it doesn't hurt to eat a turkey on Thanksgiving. But there's a lot more to it. It's really part of the legal history of America, because the Pilgrims are an example of self-government. That is, they wrote up their own constitution. It's like a constitution, but they didn't intend to. Their original plan was, and this is what they really signed up for, was to get on 2 boats, go across the water, and end up in somewhere within the jurisdiction of Virginia. Now, at that time, the territory of Virginia extended all the way up to the Hudson River, which would be New York. But they end up landing farther north than that in Massachusetts, and that's important. But they didn't expect that at the beginning. As it turned out, one boat was leaking so bad that instead of 2 boats going across, they consolidated into 1 boat, and a lot of people decided that they'd stay behind. This is looking like a little too much adventure. There's a character in one of those Tolkien stories, Bilbo Baggins. All right, y'all remember Bilbo Baggins? And they're telling him about they're getting ready to go on an adventure, and he says, "Adventure? Adventure? That sounds like the kind of thing that could make you late for dinner." It's like, I'm not into this adventure stuff. Well, some of the Pilgrims never became the Pilgrims. They stayed in England when they had all this leaky boat stuff, and they went, this is not getting off to a good start. By the time it did eventually get launched, the Mayflower, of course, was leaving much later in time than it was supposed to, which makes a difference in weather and makes a difference in what time of the year you land. Well, they intended to land in a place that already had buildings and already had a government and already had a food supply. And that's not where they landed. They ended up landing much farther north on the shores of what is now Massachusetts, where there were no buildings. And there was no grocery stores and whatever they expected from a colony that would be waiting there to greet them and to welcome them. No, they basically ended up, and it's like, oh, we weren't planning on a camping trip, but we're going to have to start from scratch. So they lived on the boat, which was at anchor, while they built structures on land to where eventually they could get off the boat and live in those structures on land. The whole thing was not going according to their plan, but God intended to have that in place where they had to invent their own government. See, if they had landed in a place that already had a government, all they had to do was just go with the flow. Whoever's in charge, just, obey that and get involved in politics if you don't like that and maybe change a few laws. But here they end up in a place where Well, let's see. I guess I should ask this question. Whose land did the pilgrims steal? Because if you watch secular TV, they'll give you the impression that these mean pilgrims came across the water and grabbed up the land that belonged to somebody else. Is that really the way it happened? No. We'll get to that in a minute. So, instead of leaving when they wanted to in the summer, they leave in September, and they sail across the open ocean. Only 2 people on board the ship had ever seen the land that they were going to. What they didn't know, and what they would learn later, was that a Huguenot, a French Calvinist, and of course, being Calvinist, he didn't have any choice in the matter anyway. But an anonymous Calvinist from France had been to that part of Massachusetts earlier and had tried to share the gospel, and all he had met with was hostility. And he eventually had gotten so angry about how whoever he was with was treating whoever he was with, that he asked God to judge the people that were in that part of Massachusetts, to judge them, to punish them for rejecting the gospel and mistreating God's messengers of the gospel. And so he asked for judgment. And, people started dying. There was some kind of a plague, and it wiped out the tribe that lived in that place. And it was killing everyone who lived there. And so what happened was the tribe that was there, as it turned out, there were only 2 members of their tribe who weren't there and therefore didn't die. In fact, those 2 individuals were in Europe at the time because they'd been captured by somebody who was fishing or fur trapping, and there's a lot of details to it, but they ended up spending time in England, learning English, and we're going to meet up with them again. But so 2 members of the tribe survive the plague. Everybody else dies of this wasting disease. So then the next door tribe says, wow, that neighborhood's empty. Everybody's dead there. We can go take their land. Let's go take their land. And so the neighboring tribe moved in and took their land. And they all died of the plague. And so now you have 2 tribes dead, minus 2 people who are away. And so then another neighboring tribe went, wow, look at that land. Nobody has that land. And everybody who used to live there, they're dead. And then the people who came to take their place, they're dead. So that land is empty, and let's leave it alone. Why do we want to go there? Whoever lives there dies. That place is cursed. And so the land was empty, and nobody wanted it. And so when the pilgrims showed up, they didn't take away the land from anybody. They didn't steal anybody's land. They took land that nobody wanted. They learned about that, and this is what they wrote in of Plymouth Plantation, which is written by William Bradford, who was their second governor, and he had a long tenure as their governor, and he kept a good journal on what was going on. And if you read the context, he's talking about three of the pilgrims, Winslow, Hopkins, and Squanto, who by that point had become one of their community. They found 40 miles from there good soil and people, not many, being dead and abundantly wasted in the late great mortality, which fell in all these parts about 3 years before the coming of the English, wherein thousands of them died. They, not being able to bury one another, their skulls and bones were found in many places lying still above the ground, where their houses and dwellings had been, a very sad spectacle to behold. But they brought word that the Narragansetts live but on the other side of that great bay, and I think that means Plymouth Bay, and were a strong people and many in number, living compact together, and had not at all been touched with this wasting disease. So the Narragansetts stayed on the other side of the bay. They said, no, thank you, we don't want that land. And as a result, they never contacted whatever that contagious disease was. And I read this passage at least 3 times, and I never saw the word COVID. So I don't think that's what was going on there. All right, we'll go back to 1620, which is when they crossed the Atlantic. And sometimes it was smooth sailing. And sometimes smooth sailing again, and sometimes not so smooth, but we'll get to that. Halfway across the Atlantic Ocean, a violent autumn storm strikes, and the main beam cracks. That's not good. And you have a leak. That's also not good when you're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. One passenger was thrown overboard. We'll get to him. Yeah, interesting character. Okay, so there's our nice sailing day, and then the clouds start getting dark. The tiny ship was tossed, but for the, oh no, that's something else. I'm getting carried away there. All right. So whatever they took with them, that's all they're going to have. Well, thankfully, one of the things that they took with them was this big old screw that was used for a printing press, and ended up using that screw like a vise to hold the main that beam that cracked. Anyway, they were able to repair the situation and save the day by using that big screw that was going to be used for a printing press. They intended to print literature when they got to the New World. So during the terrible storm, the main support beam in the Mayflower broke. The ship would have sunk without a smart idea from one of the pilgrims. The printing press that they'd taken with them, they took the big screw and they jacked the main beam back into place, and then the sailors were able to splice the beam back together again. The sailors had a bad attitude toward the pilgrims, but then they changed their attitude a little bit along the way. All right. One of the indentured servants, a guy named John Howland, he got flung overboard. So at a time when he was probably supposed to be below deck, and the ship was being slapped around by winds and waves, and at one point he just went flying off the deck, and as it turned out, there was some kind of a rope that the wind was blowing in that direction, and it slapped against his hand. And evolutionists would say this was pure luck. And that's how he survived. He was survival of the fittest, survival of the luckiest, whatever. That's the evolutionist creed. But the Christians know better, that God in his providence had that piece of rope to slap up against his arm, and so he grabbed onto it. And so as the ship tilted toward the water, and he's hanging onto the rope, he is dunked. So he may have been one who believed in sprinkling before, but at this point it's full immersion. And after being baptized, the ship rights itself, and the rope comes flinging up out of the water, and here he is holding on to it. It's like, going fishing, I guess. So the men on board pull in this rope, and hanging on to the end of it for dear life is John Howland, this indentured servant. So he's going to end up marrying Elizabeth Tilley about 3 years later. When she's an orphan. So during the Pilgrim's fourth winter, the two of them are going to get married. Now, obviously, if he had been drowned at sea, he would not have married Elizabeth Tilley about 3 years later. That makes sense, doesn't it? And if he had been drowned at sea, they would not only not have gotten married, they would not have had any children, which means their children would not have grown up, got married, and had children, which means John would never have had grandchildren. So in a matter of seconds, he either has the opportunity to just die, drowned in the Atlantic Ocean, or be rescued and be allowed to live a lot longer to get married, become a father, and become a grandfather, and have many descendants after that. So let's think about that. Here's a picture of his tombstone, and it mentions his wife. I couldn't find a photograph of his wife's tombstone, but it mentions her here. It says he married Elizabeth, daughter of John Tilley, who came with him in the Mayflower, December of 1620. That's when they actually got onto land, was December. From them are descended numerous posterity. That's an understatement. From them are descended numerous posterity. Posterity means people who come behind you. Okay, so who is this Elizabeth Tilley who becomes Mrs. Howland? She's born about 1607 to Joan and John Tilley. Her parents both die the first winter of the Mayflower Pilgrims coming to America. So she is taken in as an orphan by John Carver and his wife, and they are the first, John Carver is the first governor of the Pilgrims. But he dies within about a year, and his wife as well. So then she becomes kind of like a orphan for the second time. So she's been orphaned from her biological parents. She's been orphaned by those who took her in. And by the time her second set of parents die, she is about 16 years old. And so she marries her then guardian, which is, you guessed it, John Howland, the guy who fell into the ocean. And he had been an indentured servant who served the Carvers. So when they died, he was responsible for whatever they were responsible. So during the winter of 1623 to 1624, that's when that happens. And she will eventually die when she's 80 years old. But during the time from getting married at about 16 to dying as a widow at 80, a lot happened in her life. So try to imagine what that was like, and all of God's providences just to get these people to America, not just so that they will get to America, but because God is seeing the big picture. He's seeing the total picture. He's seeing which people are going to be procreated from which people, and what descendants they will have, and what descendants they will have, and what descendants they will have. And that's true of all of us here in this room. God has seen everything that is needful for us to get here, as well as everything is needful for all of our descendants to get here when it's time for them to get here. But in the meantime, there's a lot of adventures taking place. So let's think about Elizabeth's children after she marries the guy who fell in the ocean. The first child was a daughter, Desire, and she was mom of 11. Then came the first son, John, and he was the dad of 10. Then came another daughter, Hope, who became the mother of 12. Then came Elizabeth, named after her mother, and she became mother of 9. Then came Lydia, who was the mother of 4. Then came Hannah, the mother of 9. Then Joseph, the father of 9. Then Jabez, the father of 11. Then Ruth, the mother of 3. And then Isaac, who became the father of 8. What if John and Elizabeth had never married? Well, all of those children would not have been born, and all of those grandchildren would not have been born. So eventually, Jabez, who's father of 11, takes in his parents when they get too old to take care of themselves independently. And so John and Elizabeth move in with their son Jabez and his 11 growing kids. You know, they're leaving the nest, one or two at a time. Then in 1680, Elizabeth becomes a widow. As a widow, she moves in with, and apparently dies that same year, but she moves in with her daughter Lydia, who is one who only had 4 children. So, there's plenty of room. That house, which of course has had reconstruction to keep it up, but that, I believe, is supposed to be the oldest house that we have of the Pilgrims that still has some of the original parts. Well, who are some of the descendants of John and Elizabeth Howland whose faces you might recognize today? Well, there's a few of them. So you see some Bushes, and you see some Roosevelts, and you see Sarah Palin, and some guy who's back from the future. And there's a whole lot more descendants of John and Elizabeth Howland. That's just a few. So a lot was at stake when the Mayflower was crossing the water and when that little community was getting established. And because they couldn't just accept whatever government was already in place, they had to invent their own. And as a result, they became a role model for the Constitutional Convention that would come later in 1787, when Madison would do most of the writing of what we now live under today. I say we, I mean those of us in this room live under the U.S. Constitution here in America. We've got some judges who don't live under that Constitution, that they make up their own rules, but I think everyone here in this room actually lives under the Constitution that was written up in 1787. And they had to really invent their own government from scratch. And that they weren't the first ones to do that, because the Mayflower pilgrims had done a smaller scale version of that earlier. So if you are descended from one of those, you can be like the little boy in the corner there who says, "My dad signed the Mayflower Compact." Anyway, so what are some of the ways in which we have been blessed by that and can recognize God's sovereignty? Well, for one thing, because of God's sovereignty, they didn't land where they intended to land. And as a result, they had to face and live in this adventure called independence and invent their own government and follow its laws. And they did so with a Christian worldview. It was never easy. They had harsh winters that they were unaccustomed to in England. And they recognized that, and they wanted those who came after them to appreciate how God had took up for them. And William Bradford recalls, being thus past the vast ocean and a sea of troubles before in their preparation, as may be remembered by those who went before, they had no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses, or much less towns, to repair to seek for help. And he recognizes it was only God's grace that they survived. But what could not sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? May not and ought not the children of these fathers rightly say, "Our fathers were Englishmen who came over this great ocean and were ready to perish in this wilderness. But they cried unto the Lord, and He heard their voice and looked on their adversity. And God provided for them." They landed at Plymouth Rock, and they named a band after that. The genre of music was called Plymouth Rock, and you can see the drumsticks being used by the drummer there. Anyway, they did have humble beginnings. Some of that might be a little bit fake history there. But the first winter was harsh. About half of the pilgrims died the first winter. And of the Tilleys, of course, only Elizabeth, who was then 13, survived the first winter. Imagine being a 13-year-old and all of a sudden you're in a new land. You don't. The only people you know are the people who came over in the boat, and your parents have died, and you're an orphan. And then within a year, your adoptive parents both die too. Well, one of the things they were trying to do is find enough food to survive. And at one point, they found some stacks of food, such as some corn that was heaped up and some other beans, I believe it was. And being Englishmen and understanding English law, they understood, and this is something that the secular history books will get wrong. They'll say, they stole the Indians' food. No, what they did was they took stored up food that had been stored up by Indians who died, who weren't going to come back to eat it anyway. And so they took it. But being Englishmen who obeyed the law and believed in the rule of law, they knew that there was a law called the law of private necessity. And basically, let me illustrate that. If you have a house and it's on fire, and you have a child on the second floor that you could reach if you could just get up to that window, because the fire's on the bottom floor and there's lots of smoke, and if you try to go in that way, it probably won't solve the problem. Your neighbor who's on vacation has a big ladder laying by the side of his house. You run over, you get that ladder, you prop it up to your house. You didn't get permission from your neighbor to do this. That's because lives are in danger. And so you are allowed under English law to do this, to take your neighbor's property without his permission in order to save a life. And you prop it up against your house, you climb up that ladder real fast like a squirrel, you grab the baby, you come down, and as you just get to you get down, the flames have come out of the window. They're now burning up the ladder. And the ladder gets burned up, so what good would it do for you to return it to your neighbor? Okay, well, under English law, that was okay, but you have to pay for the ladder. And so under the law of private necessity, if you are if your life is at risk or a family member's life is at risk, it's okay to use somebody else's property to keep someone from dying. But once the emergency is over, you have a duty to pay for whatever it is that you use that you can't return, in healthy condition. And of course, if they eat the corn, you don't want them to return it. So they considered it a very serious obligation on their part to find whoever that food belonged to and pay fair market value for that food. Well, when they realized they couldn't pay those who the food originally belonged to because they were all dead, then they said, no, we need to find out which tribe is the closest to the tribe that died, figure out the value of the food that we took, and pay that amount of money to the tribe who are their next of kin. That's how seriously they took their obligations. So they called that the Cornhill Emergency. So they found water, they refreshed themselves, they were digging around, they found corn in ears, that is, ears of corn, fair and good of diverse colors, which seemed to them a goodly sight. And so they went ahead and they ate it, and they carried it away, and it reminded them of the good of the land that the spies saw when they surveilled Canaan, which is recorded in Numbers chapter 13. They found 2 of their houses covered with mats, but the people were not there. Originally, they thought they must have run away. They found out later that no, it was worse than that. They found their corn and their beans of various colors. They purposed to give them full satisfaction. That means they intended to pay in full what the value of that food was that they were taking for their private emergency. And about 6 months later, they did pay the value of that food to the next of kin. So they were law-abiding, respecting the rights of their neighbors type of people. And they made friends with their neighbors. And both sides benefited. This was a win-win situation. The Indians showed, through Squanto, who we'll talk more about in a minute, showed the pilgrims how to plant dirt by leaving fish trash wrapped around the seeds as a fertilizer. So if you take a herring and you eat the good part, whatever is the part you're not going to eat, you wrap the seeds for your next year's corn crop in that, and that becomes good fertilizer, and you get a better yield. But they also benefited the Indians by teaching them, I don't think I have a slide for this. No, I don't. They also taught them how to plant in rows so that they could maximize the space. They were good at utilizing the space to get the largest crop possible. So the Indians were not accustomed to using rows and spacing out the crops. They were just more, just put some here, put some here, put some here. So they were able to get better yields by using the English method of planting crops. So both sides shared their wisdom for agricultural results, and it was a win-win situation. It was hard work, of course, and this is one case in which it took a village to be a village. But as far as raising children, they did that one family at a time. It was not a communist situation. In March of 1621, which is the first spring after they land, they are greeted by an English-speaking Indian named Samoset. And then very soon after that, that is, looks like 6 days later, I'm hesitant to do the math here because Sherry says don't do math in public. But anyway, on the 26th of the same month, Squanto comes up. He speaks English better than Samoset, and between the two of them, they act as translators between the local tribes and the English-speaking pilgrims. Actually, the Indian who helped them the most is going to come later. In fact, his name is Hobbamock. Hobbamock becomes the most helpful Indian who moves in with them. He doesn't get much press because Squanto is remembered as getting, he seems to get all the popular press. But he actually died very soon after that. He wasn't with them that long. Okay, so Squanto dies November of 1622. He only meets him in March of 1621. So he wasn't with him for very long. but Hobbamock was with them long term. In fact, Hobbamock so appreciated the Pilgrims and Captain Miles Standish in particular that he wanted to move his house right next to Miles Standish's house. So it's kind of like a duplex. And so he was real happy. He moved his family, including both of his wives, all of his children, and his house was right next to Miles Standish's house. And he wanted Miles Standish to teach him the Christian faith. He wanted to be as Christian as he could. And so they became very good friends. Well, one time, now there was you also have the people who are doing good, and then you have the troublemakers. You have a troublemaker named Corbitant. He is not the top Indian chief of his tribe, but he's jealous of the one who is. But the one who is has made a friendship treaty with the Pilgrims. And Corbitant doesn't like that. Massasoit is a friendly Indian chief, and he has this agreement with the Pilgrims that they're going to live in peace and help one another. Corbitant doesn't like that, and he also wants Massasoit's job. So he decides to stir up trouble. And he and his men decide to ambush and capture Squanto and Hobbamock. Why do they want to do this? Because they recognize that Squanto and Hobbamock, because they are friends of the Pilgrims, live with the Pilgrims, and can act as translators, they provide that service so that the Pilgrims can interact with the outside world of Indian tribes. So Corbitant figures if we can get rid of Squanto and Hobbamock, we've kind of cut off the communication that the Pilgrims can have with tribes on the outside. It'll be a lot easier to isolate them and get rid of them. So they capture the both of them, but Hobbamock escapes. So he goes running back to the Pilgrims' compound and says, Corbitant's men have just captured Squanto, and I think I know where they've probably taken him. Miles Standish, who's the man of action, on August 14th of 1622 says, okay, let's take 10 men and we're going to do a night op. We are going to go right away. We're going to travel fast through the night. Whatever we can carry in our hands, that's what we're taking. And we're going to do a surprise attack before they've woken up and gotten used to tomorrow. And we're going to surprise them when the light is almost not there. And we're going to rescue our friend Squanto. So Hobbamock, who at this point is very much a Christian and has kind of adopted into Miles Standish's family, he and Miles Standish are the two who lead this night raid to rescue Squanto. Squanto is successfully rescued, and one of the things that Miles Standish said was, I want to know who their leader is. I want to recognize Corbitant when I see him. Hobbamock, you tell me, what does he look like? And Hobbamock says, oh, you won't have a problem figuring out who he is. As soon as the attack happens, he'll be the fastest one to run away from the battle. All right? The fastest guy out the door who doesn't want to stand up to anything, that's their leader. That's the kind of leader he is. He leads from behind, way behind. Anyway, so that's what happens. They have an attack. They set the Indians' village on fire to distract him, and then they rush in and they have to club a few people. Some people get hurt. They shoot their muskets, and 2 of the Indians that they attack get severely wounded. So they take them back to the Pilgrims' place, and they treat their wounds. And they take care of them until those 2 wounded enemies are well enough to be taken back to their village. And so they return them healed. Kind of reminds you of something in the Old Testament where the prophet had his enemies fed and then sent them back home. Well, anyway, so after their medical treatment, news spreads. And one of the first things that's being talked about in that part of the land is when the Pilgrims say that they're going to make a friendship deal with you, they really mean it. And if you are captured, but you have a bond with them, they're going to come through the night to rescue you. That wasn't common. Okay, now the dates are important here. That was September 13th of 1621. Next thing you know, the Indian tribes are wanting to have friendship treaties with the Pilgrims. They've decided it's good to be in a friendship relationship with the Pilgrims. They will come to your aid when it's a hard time for you. Later that same year, now that was just in, what was that, September? Okay, September 13th. And here just a couple months later, you have the first Thanksgiving. That made a difference. And I don't think I have the dates here, but let me talk a bit about the friendship treaties. So you have one tribe, I'll just say Tribe A, who makes a deal with the Pilgrims under Massasoit to become friends, meaning if we're attacked, you'll come to our aid, and vice versa. Okay, now that word is spread that the Pilgrims are really true friends, you want to have them on your side. Tribe B comes up to the Pilgrims and says, we want to have a friendship treaty with you too. And so the Pilgrims answer back, that's okay, but because we have a friendship treaty with Tribe A, you also have to have a friendship treaty with Tribe A, because we have to come to their aid and they come to our aid. So if we're going to come to your aid and you're going to come to our aid, this is it's a kind of an all or nothing thing. And the negotiators on behalf of Tribe B go, does that really have to be part of the deal? We kind of like fighting with Tribe A, especially when their crops are just about ready to harvest. That's a good time to attack. Saves a lot of work. And Pilgrim says, sorry, that's the way it is. If you won't be part of a friendship treaty with Tribe A, then we will not enter into a friendship treaty with you. Wow, you drive a hard bargain. I guess we could learn to live at peace with Tribe A if we really had to. Okay, so they cut a deal. So now A and B are together with the Pilgrims. So now Tribe C wants to have a friendship treaty with the Pilgrims. They come, they find out the same thing. We won't enter into a friendship treaty with you unless you do the same thing with Tribe A and Tribe B. No way, we hate Tribe B. We've hated them for generations. Well, sorry, we can't have a friendship treaty with you. Really? I mean, y'all really mean that? I mean, there isn't like a loophole in the contract or something where we reserve the rights to attack them, right around harvest time maybe? Nope, sorry, that's the way it is. So long story short, the neighboring tribes all negotiate friendship treaties where they have to be friends with one another and they can't attack one another. And you end up with peace for many decades because of these interlocked friendship treaties. So when the secular TV tells you the Pilgrims came and they ruined everything, well, what they ruined was a lot of tribes that were stealing and killing one another and dying of diseases because they couldn't get enough food because they destroyed the food in the wars. And you ended up with it wasn't the millennium, but it sure was a lot better than what it had been before that. So the first Thanksgiving was a recognition that God had blessed through all these hard times and was producing good results among the people there, and many of the Indians were becoming Christians. So you had the Great Commission going on with the gospel being shared with the Indians, and you also had the Genesis mandate going on because you had God's people being dispersed to other parts of the inhabitable world and taking the gospel with them and honoring God in different places that He'd made. So when we think about history and God's providence in history, what we could call providential history, one of the things we need to do is be good scholars, do good research, and don't fall for what they say on secular TV about what happened in the past, because there's tons of fake history out there, just like there's fake news and fake theology. I mean, there's just lies all over the place, and you have to dig to get at the truth. But once you have nailed down what is true, then we're supposed to hold it fast. And that's part of what goes with the Great Commission. So as we are going, the going reminds you of filling the earth, that is a command that God gave to Noah and his family as they got off the ark, and that not only are we being fruitful and multiplying, but we're also filling the earth. We should not be surprised when we see people go to different places and take God's truth with them as they go. And what do we do in the process? We are discipling all nations. We are teaching in a discipling way. And then, of course, recognizing those who've made good professions of faith, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and then didactically teaching them to observe, to keep, to protect all the things whatsoever Christ has commanded. That's the big picture, and our family history fits within that big picture. And so one of the things that we can do is thank God for all that he did to make you who you are with your family, with the family that you were born into, with the family that you are married into, if you are married, and then, of course, the forever family that you belong to by belonging to Christ. And within that forever family, there are probably some special people who God has used in a really big way to bless you and to teach you his truth. And what God has done in their lives is important. And then in the ancestry of all three of those categories is important. The last thing I'll say is I want to show you my tie. I got to watch this cord here. It's kind of like, when you're vacuuming, you got to hold the cord so that you don't trip over it. All right. What kind of a tie is this? What's depicted on this tie? Okay, we got some horses, and they look like the horses that you might see in the year 1066 in what's called the Battle of Hastings, right? Okay, there's the Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts the Battle of Hastings. What happened at the Battle of Hastings on October 14th of 1066? Did it affect you? Okay, William the Conqueror came across the English Channel from Normandy, France, and successfully invaded England and defeated the defending king, Harold Godwinson, and was the last one to conquer England. And so the royal family of England to this day is a direct descent from William the Conqueror. How does that affect us as Americans? Get to that in a second. It was really important for America that William the Conqueror would at least survive that day. I mean, maybe not win the battle, but maybe he could have escaped, like the way that Courbetante just zipped out. But anyway, it was really important that he survived. And as it turned out, he not only survived, he won the battle. 2 years later, he had his last-born son and his only son to be born on English soil, and that was Henry Beauclerk, who became King Henry of England later in life because all his older brothers died off before his father did. So they didn't expect Henry to become the king, but he ended up becoming the king. But of more importance to us in this room was that Henry was born 2 days after the Battle of Hastings, which means if his father had died in the Battle of Hastings, he never would have been born. Y'all with me on that so far? Henry I married and had children, and they had descendants, and they had descendants, and they had descendants, and one of their descendants was about, I better not do math, it's something like, it's quite a few centuries, maybe 700 centuries. 700, forget about it. All right. 700 years later, that's what I meant to say. One of his direct descendants is born, and his name is George Washington. So if William the Conqueror had died at the Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, there would have been no George Washington. That would have affected America. Now let's go back a few days to a different Viking battle, and that is on September 29th, 24th, anyway, in September, about 19 days before the Battle of Hastings. There was another battle farther north in England where a different group of Vikings came to attack England and to attack their king, Harold Godwinson. And the one leading that battle, that invasion, was Harold Hardrada, who had had many adventures all over Russia and the Mediterranean and Scandinavia and the Baltic and Eastern Europe. And in fact, he'd been in the British Isles. He had really roamed the world. He'd had adventures, and everything he did seemed to be successful. And he was king of Norway at the end. And whenever he'd go to battle, he would wear this mail coat that covered his neck and chest and stuff like that. Well, that particular September day in 1066, when he was getting ready to fight the Battle of Stamford Bridge, It was kind of hot, and he decided not to wear his male shirt. Wrong idea. Anyway, he took a arrow in the throat, which would have been protected, and something happened to him that day that had never happened before in battle. He died. It had never happened before. And but thankfully, his son, Olaf, was given parking lot. They don't call it parking lot. It's where they park the boats. Anyway, he was supposed to guard the boats that were parked of the 300 Viking ships that had come to attack England. It was such a bloody battle and such a bad day for the invading Norwegians and Orcadians and others that came with them that it only took about 23 or 24 ships, I forget which. I was very young at the time, so I don't remember all the details. But it only took about 24 ships to take the survivors back to Norway. And remember, 300 ships full of warriors came. So your odds of surviving, if you were on the Norwegian side that day, were about 8 in 100. That is, about 8% of those who came to attack survived that day. One of those, thankfully, was Olaf, the son of Harald Hardrada. Olaf, about 6 years later, gets married, and he's called Olaf the Peaceful. He decided never to get into the battles business, and he had a peaceful reign. But about 6 years later, after that battle, which it's good that he survived, he gave birth to a son, Magnus. And from Magnus's line of descent comes someone that you have heard of, King James, who authorized and sponsored the King James Bible English translation. Would the world have been different without King James? Well, some would go, well, somebody else would have done the same thing. Really? Look at all the other countries. How many of them had kings who, in a very official way, encouraged and sponsored the translation of the Bible into their common language? King James was a very unusual guy. God blessed him in a very providential way. And there are now more than 2 billion copies of the English Bible and the King James translation in print around the world. That doesn't even include what's on the internet or quoted pieces of the King James Bible in books and commentaries, things like that. So just in the year 1066, the future life of King James hung in the balances in September of that year. And yet God made sure that Olaf survived that bloody day, and eventually one of his descendants would sponsor the English Bible that is the most published book of anything in the history of the world. And then just 19 days later, the Battle of Hastings reminds us that God needed to keep William the Conqueror alive long enough to become the father of Henry, through whom we get George Washington. God has been at work all the time in many ways, and we'll never know the half of it, at least not in this life. And he's a very wonderful God, and he is in control of family histories, yours, and the people who've been a blessing to you, and the people who, in the case of having the availability of an English Bible or having the availability of a country called America, God was at work in many different family histories just so that we could be blessed in the many ways that we've been blessed. Well, let me say a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for being our God. Thank you for being in charge of history and for providing your providential interventions in all these different details so that we would be who we are and have the blessings that we have. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation. That was fascinating. I love that history at the end. But we don't have any time for questions.
Oh.
That's the mark of a good professor or teacher. That way you don't get put on the spot. And you just use all of your time. I want to recommend two things. They've got a few copies of this book back there at the ICR table. The Long War Against God by Henry Morris. That is an outstanding book. It's one of about 20 books I recommend that if you're a pastor, you probably ought to read every 5 to 10 years because it's chock full of great information. And then there's also a biography there written by Rebecca Morris Barber. So she's the granddaughter?
No, she is the baby of the family. So
Okay.
she was the last daughter to be born.
And it's
to
on
Morris.
Henry Morris, father of modern creationism. Do you have this, Charlie? Okay, good. So this is, it's good to know about these people. Read your biographies, read your history. History is very, very important.